Since childhood, everyone looked at me as if I were made of polished porcelain, beautiful, valuable, and too fragile to be touched without gloves. Elowen D'Arcy. The name sounded like a promise, a burden, a sentence. I grew up hearing speeches about honor, legacy, and responsibility, as if my existence were an extension of my family's history. They didn't teach me to dream, they taught me to perform, to maintain perfect posture in photos, to smile even when my chest burned with the urge to scream, to accept decisions already made as if they were my own. For years, I played that role flawlessly, wearing clothes I didn't choose, sitting at tables that bored me, shaking hands with people who saw me as a strategic piece. And yet, there were nights when, lying alone in a room with windows too large, I wondered if there was anything left in me that was real, or if, at some point along the way, I had become just a smiling portrait hung on the walls of a story I never wrote. But everything began to change the moment he looked at me, not as a name, a surname, or a potential title, but as just someone. I remember the exact moment. There was exhaustion in my body, as always, but there was something different in the way he asked my name, as if he had no idea who I was, or worse, as if he didn't care. And that, instead of wounding my trained pride, ignited something long, dormant, the desire to be truly seen. For the first time, I was forced to confront a question I'd avoided for years. Who am I, away from the throne? Away from the script? Away from the suffocating expectation of perfection? In that moment, I realized the size of the prison where I smiled every day. And for the first time, I wanted something that couldn't be taught, measured, or inherited. I wanted to be free. I wanted to choose, not out of duty, but out of love. And that desire, so simple and so dangerous, began to change everything. His name was Noah, and unlike everything that had always surrounded me, he didn't have a surname that opened doors, didn't come from any notable lineage, didn't belong to any exclusive club, and didn't know the unspoken rules of the world I was raised in. He was simple, not in a shallow sense, but in the deepest one. He had no unnecessary layers, no masks to please others. He spoke with conviction, but without arrogance. He listened with genuine interest, without pretense. And when he looked at me, there was a calm in his eyes that made me forget to breathe. The first time we talked for more than 10 minutes, I felt something strange, not nervousness or excitement. It was as if something inside me had finally settled. For the first time, I didn't have to perform. I started seeking him out without realizing it. My obligations felt emptier after our conversations. The meetings, the dinners, the interviews, everything began to feel like too much theater. I caught myself laughing alone, remembering some silly joke he'd made effortlessly, while those around me seemed to recite the same lines for decades. And with that, I began to change. Small rebellions, taking off expensive shoes in the middle of the afternoon, declining an invitation without explanation, spending an entire day ignoring my advisors. Nothing scandalous, but enough for the looks around me to grow restless. My mother was the first to notice. She said I seemed distracted, less present. My father, always focused on the next campaign, merely commented that I was losing sight of what truly mattered. They didn't know that for the first time in my life, I was beginning to understand what mattered to me. Noah didn't know everything about my life, and I deliberately kept some details at a distance. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear that, upon discovering the scale of the structure surrounding me, he'd pull back. Fear that seeing me as a cog in a larger machine, he'd stop seeing who I was when it was just the two of us. And most of all, fear that I'd start seeing myself that way again, as part of something that crushed me. With him, I could be just Elowen, just a woman, just someone with doubts, desires, fears, dreams. And in that small but true space, love began to grow. A silent love, undeclared, but so evident that even when we were apart, it filled what was missing. The pressures started slowly, like someone knocking politely before breaking down the door. First came the subtle questions. Where have you been spending so much time, Elowen? Who is this young man no one knows? Accompanied by cold smiles and looks that no longer hid their discomfort. Then came the reminders, the invitations disguised as orders, dinners with investors, meetings with influential families, public appearances with carefully selected vases to reinforce the image of the perfect successor. Everything seemed meticulously calculated to reposition me at the center of what had always surrounded me, the invisible throne that was my destiny since birth. And I tried to balance two worlds that didn't touch. By day, I smiled for cameras and greeted strangers who spoke as if they'd known me forever. By night, I escaped to Noah, and there, in slow conversations and hands intertwined under the table, I found the only part of me that was still mine. But that division was eroding me. I felt I was losing something precious every time I denied who he was, and he, even without saying it, felt it too. There was a kind of sadness in his eyes when I changed the subject, when I avoided talking about my world, when I kept him outside of everything that was truly part of my life. That man, so whole, was starting to get hurt in the gaps I left between us. It was at a gala that the crack became a chasm. I wore a red dress chosen by someone else, with jewels that belonged to my great-grandmother, and a smile that had nothing to do with what I felt. They asked me about a supposed engagement to a young politician aligned with my family's interests. I laughed elegantly, deflected with diplomacy. But inside, something in me broke. That same night, Noah sent me a message. Do you still know who you are? I stared at that question for long minutes as if it were a mirror, and I didn't know how to answer. In the days that followed, we drifted apart. Not because we stopped loving each other, but because the weight of the unspoken began to crush everything that still held us together. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that I could reconcile everything, that love would adapt. But deep down, I knew. Either I'd choose the path expected of me, or I'd have to give up everything for something that came with no guarantees, only truth. I went, days without replying to his message, not out of neglect, but because every time I tried to type something, my fingers trembled and my heart tightened, as if I were about to commit a crime against myself. Do you still know who you are? That question echoed like an acidic whisper, corroding the fragile foundations I pretended to uphold. I woke up in the middle of the night with his face in my mind, and the image of my family looming just behind, like a shadow that never left me alone. The truth was, I knew who I was, with him. What I didn't know was if I had the courage to be that person all the time. To be Elowen, just Elowen, without the weight of D'Arcy, without the world's eyes expecting perfection. My mother was direct, as always. She said there were rumors that the council was concerned that my involvement with someone outside the standard could jeopardize years of work. She called it a whim. She used that word as if it were an accusation, as if loving were a juvenile mistake, a misstep made before adulthood demanded obedience. My father was colder. He said succession required sacrifices, that love, the life I'd chosen, was a dangerous luxury. You can like him, he said, but you can't let it weaken you. I wanted to scream that loving was never weakness, that hiding feelings was a silent way of dying every day. But I stayed, silent, because in that moment I realized there was no room for truth in the world they'd built around me. I met Noah one last time before the final storm. He didn't ask why I'd disappeared. He didn't complain. He just looked at me with that calm, devastating way that unraveled me inside. "I love you, Elowen," he said, "but I can't fight for you if you don't know what you want." It hurt more than any warning from my family, because it was true, because it was fair, because he deserved more than halves, and I, as much as I loved him, still wasn't sure if I was capable of giving up everything for him, or if I'd spend my life trying to convince him to stay in a world where he'd never fit. After he left, the silence was deafening. Nothing made sense. The glory they promised me had no flavor, no color. The public events, the meetings, the interviews, everything felt like a decaying theater where I was the only one who knew the tragic ending. I could go on. I could follow the plan. I could wear the crown, give the speeches, smile for the papers. But inside I knew that meant abandoning myself. It took exactly 8 days for me to look in the mirror and face the woman I'd become. 8 days of smiling for cameras, rehearsing lines that sounded like someone else's, wearing dresses designed for a version of me that no longer existed. But that morning, with the sun slipping through the curtain's gap and silence wrapping me like a cold embrace, I finally understood. I could keep living a perfectly acceptable lie, or I could strip it away entirely, even if that left me exposed, vulnerable, and alone. It wasn't about Noah. It was about me, about what I'd allow to be built with my name, my story, my life. The decision didn't come with glory. There were no applause, no audience. There was fear. A cold, real fear that made me tremble as I pressed the send button on a letter that summed it all up. My abdication from the succession. Not with bitterness or rebellion, but with resolve. I didn't want to play a role anymore. I wanted to live. And living, for me, didn't mean being the symbol of an empire. It meant walking the streets with a coffee in hand, choosing my silences, my affections, my truths. It meant being just Elowen, without the weight of a surname stamped on my skin like a brand. The letter exploded like a bomb in every circle where my name circulated. Headlines, interviews, attempts to reach me, invitations to reconsider. They called me ungrateful, impulsive, influenced. They said it was a temporary mistake, that I was blinded by passion, that in time I'd understand the magnitude of the opportunity I'd squandered. But for the first time, the external noise didn't shake me, because inside, the sound of freedom was louder. I went to him, not with promises or poetic declarations, but with steady eyes and an open heart. He looked at me as if he couldn't believe it, as if he'd learned not to expect anything more from me. But I went all the way without hesitation. I said I didn't know what came next, that life might be difficult, messy, uncertain. But I also said that if he still wanted me, I was ready, not just to love him, but to live fully by his side, without masks, without divisions, without shadows. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me with teary eyes like someone carrying the memory of all the times he tried to believe and couldn't. There was silence between us, but it wasn't the silence of doubt. It was the silence of surrender, a sacred space where no word dared break the ragged breathing, the restrained trembling of hands, the miracle of seeing me there, finally whole. When he walked toward me and wrapped me in a slow, firm, unhurried embrace, I knew that there, in those arms without titles, without a surname, without expectations, I had finally arrived. For the first time, I didn't feel part of anything grandiose, and curiously, that's exactly when I discovered what it truly means to be great. The months that followed were about rebuilding. I was no longer the D'Arcy family princess, no longer on magazine covers, no longer the obligatory presence at dinners that shaped the course of things. I was just Elowen, Elowen with paint-stained hands after painting the walls of our new home. Elowen with her hair tied back haphazardly, laughing loudly in the grocery store line, holding his hand as if that were my new title of nobility. The newspapers forgot me as quickly as they'd once idolized me. The world moved on. And for the first time, so did I. Loving Noah wasn't a fairy tale. There were bills, doubts, the clash of two worlds. But there was also the peace of sleeping, beside someone who knew my soul, not the role I'd been given. There was space to grow, to err, to start over. And in the midst of it all, I learned that the throne awaiting me was never mine. It was a construct of expectation, tradition, and fear. What was truly mine, I only found when I let go of everything. What was mine was in that love that gave me back to myself. Today, when I look back, I don't see renunciation. I see choice. Choosing love, for me, was choosing freedom. And perhaps that was the greatest form of royalty I could exercise, reigning over my own life with courage, with truth, with love. They always told me royalty was an inheritance, a birthright, a calling that couldn't be refused. I spent my life believing it. I followed rules I didn't choose, performed a perfection I didn't feel, bowed to expectations that carried my family's name more than my own. But now, looking at the quiet mornings beside Noah, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sun invading the house without permission, I understand. Royalty has nothing to do with thrones. It has to do with courage. Courage to be who you are even when the world demands otherwise. Courage to love with abandon, even without guarantees. Courage to choose your own voice over the echo of generations. I wasn't crowned before crowds. There's no crowd here. But every time he calls my name and smiles as if I were the center of the universe, not because of my legacy, but because of who I've become, I feel more sovereign than I ever did, wearing any crown. And if anyone ever asks what I lost by leaving the throne, I'll answer with serenity. Nothing that was worth more than the woman I found when I decided for the first time to reign over myself.